As the first-class cabin settled into a quiet hum, Ryan leaned toward the unassuming man beside him, still unaware of the truth. "You know, people like you don't usually belong in spaces like this," Ryan sneered, adjusting his tie smugly. The man, calm and composed, glanced at him with a faint smile and replied, "Sometimes belonging isn't about appearances, but how you treat others." Moments later, a flight attendant approached with a message. "Mr. Reeves, the captain sends his regards." The cabin fell silent as recognition dawned. Ryan had just insulted Keanu Reeves. But before we dive deeper into this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another amazing story like this one. Los Angeles International Airport buzzed with life, a microcosm of the world in motion. The terminal was alive with sounds, the hum of announcements blending with snippets of conversation in multiple languages, the rumble of suitcases rolling across the tiled floor, and the occasional laughter of families reunited. Travelers from all walks of life filled the space. Students with backpacks slung over their shoulders, executives in tailored suits clutching leather briefcases, and tourists juggling passports and guidebooks. Amid the chaos, there was a sense of organized disorder, as if every movement contributed to the rhythm of the airport's pulse. In the midst of it all stood Keanu Reeves, an enigma of calm in a sea of urgency. He was dressed simply, a plaid shirt slightly faded and worn, paired with jeans that had seen their fair share of adventures and scuffed brown boots that told stories of miles traveled. His only accessory was a weathered backpack slung over one shoulder, its edges fraying with age. There was nothing flashy about him, and yet he exuded a quiet presence that seemed to create an invisible bubble of serenity around him. While others checked their watches and shifted nervously in line, Keanu appeared entirely unbothered by the rush, his gaze wandering across the terminal as if he were soaking in every detail. Behind him in the first-class line stood Ryan Carter, a man who couldn't have been more different. At 38, Ryan had built his career as an entrepreneur, and his appearance reflected the image he worked hard to cultivate. His tailored navy suit fit him perfectly, his shoes gleamed as if they had just been polished, and his wristwatch, a luxury brand he made sure was visible, glinted under the terminal lights. Everything about Ryan screamed success, and he made sure everyone around him noticed. His eyes darted across the line, cataloging everyone in sight, his posture rigid as though he were determined to maintain a sense of superiority, even while standing still. As Ryan's gaze settled on Keanu, a faint smirk crept across his face. He couldn't help but mutter under his breath, loud enough for Keanu to hear, "First class sure isn't what it used to be." Keanu turned his head slightly, his expression unchanging, calm and composed. With a small, almost imperceptible smile, he replied, "Maybe it's changed for the better." The response caught Ryan off guard. He had expected indignation, a defensive remark, or perhaps even an embarrassed shuffle. Instead, Keanu's unbothered demeanor left Ryan momentarily speechless. For a man like Ryan, who thrived on dominance and control, Keanu's lack of engagement was a puzzle he wasn't quite prepared to solve. Ryan straightened his tie, his irritation growing as he watched Keanu shift his weight casually, as if the comment had meant nothing. For Ryan, this was unacceptable. He wasn't accustomed to being dismissed so effortlessly, and the interaction sparked a need to assert himself further. As the line crept forward, Ryan made a mental note to keep this unassuming stranger in his sight. Something about him, his simplicity, his calmness, rubbed Ryan the wrong way, and he was determined to figure out why. The first-class boarding call echoed through the terminal, signaling the start of a journey neither man would soon forget. As the first-class boarding line moved forward, Keanu Reeves stepped onto the plane with his signature calmness, taking in his surroundings as if each detail deserved quiet appreciation. He located his seat, 2A, and tucked his worn backpack neatly under the seat in front of him. Settling in, he adjusted the seatbelt and leaned back, exuding the same unhurried energy he had at the terminal. Behind him, Ryan Carter strode onto the plane, his polished shoes clicking confidently against the cabin floor. His eyes scanned the first-class cabin as if assessing the exclusivity of the space. When he arrived at 2B, his confident smirk faltered. Standing next to the man he had judged so dismissively in the terminal, Ryan froze for a brief second before forcing a composed expression. "You've got to be kidding me," Ryan muttered under his breath as he slid into the seat next to Keanu. The faint amusement in his voice barely masked his irritation. Adjusting his suit jacket, he glanced sideways at Keanu, who appeared unbothered by the coincidence. Keanu offered a polite nod. "Looks like we're traveling together," he said, his tone as neutral as ever. Ryan gave a tight smile, the kind reserved for uncomfortable interactions, and busied himself organizing his carry-on items. As he stowed his laptop bag under the seat, he glanced at Keanu's scuffed boots and faded jeans, shaking his head subtly as if trying to process the perceived mismatch between the man and his surroundings. The silence lingered for a few moments, but Ryan couldn't help himself. Leaning slightly toward Keanu, he initiated conversation in a tone laced with subtle condescension. "So," he began, "what brings you to first class? Business or pleasure?" Keanu looked up from adjusting his seat controls, his expression unchanging. "Neither, really, just traveling." Ryan chuckled softly, his disbelief poorly hidden. "Well, I suppose you don't have to dress the part to be here, right?" His tone hovered just on the edge of mockery. Keanu paused for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Sometimes comfort is more important than appearances." Ryan's smirk deepened. "Comfort? Sure. But you know, for some of us, appearances actually matter. People notice." He straightened his suit as if to emphasize his point. Keanu turned his gaze to the window, letting the conversation drop without response. Ryan's irritation grew, his need to assert superiority simmering as he glanced at his unassuming neighbor. While Keanu projected effortless calm, Ryan fidgeted, his polished exterior betraying the unease brewing inside. The plane ascended smoothly, the hum of the engines creating a steady backdrop. Ryan leaned back in his seat, clearly restless. He glanced sideways at Keanu, who seemed content, quietly sipping a glass of water. Unable to suppress his curiosity and need to size up his neighbor, Ryan turned toward him with a practiced smile. "Oh, what do you do?" Ryan asked casually, as if the answer would somehow confirm his assumptions. Keanu looked up, his expression calm and polite. "I work in film." Ryan raised an eyebrow, his tone immediately skeptical. "Oh, film? Like what? Commercials? Local stuff?" Keanu shook his head slightly, his demeanor unaffected. "Something like that," he said, keeping the explanation brief. Ryan chuckled softly, the kind of laugh that wasn't meant to be shared. "Well, good for you. Though I have to say, first class isn't exactly the place for simplicity, is it? It's more about presentation." He gestured toward his suit, a clear nod to his own sense of style. Keanu met Ryan's gaze for a moment before replying, "Sometimes simplicity speaks louder than anything else." Ryan tilted his head as if trying to decipher whether this was wisdom or deflection. "I guess that works for some people," he said, his tone laced with dismissiveness. "Not everyone's built for this kind of space, though." Keanu didn't respond, instead turning his attention back to the window. Ryan crossed his arms, feeling an itch to reassert himself. The silence between them settled uneasily. From the economy section, a ripple of laughter caught the attention of several passengers in first class. A black family, a father, mother, and 2 young children, were engaged in an animated conversation. The kids giggled loudly, their joyful energy cutting through the otherwise subdued atmosphere. Ryan frowned, turning his head toward the sound. After a moment of watching them, he leaned forward slightly and flagged down a flight attendant. Excuse me," Ryan said in a low voice, though not low enough to avoid being overheard. "Is there any way to, remind people to keep things a little more appropriate? Some of us are trying to enjoy the flight." The flight attendant hesitated, glancing toward the family. Her professional smile faltered. "They're not being disruptive, sir," she replied diplomatically. "They're just enjoying themselves." Ryan leaned back with a sigh. "I guess some people just don't know how to behave in public spaces." Keanu turned to Ryan, his expression calm but his voice carrying an edge of firmness. Maybe instead of judging, you could learn something from their joy. Ryan scoffed, his smirk returning. Joy? Sure, but let's be honest. There's a reason people like that don't usually end up here. Keanu's gaze didn't waver. People end up where they're meant to be. Maybe it's time to think about why you feel the need to question that. Ryan's smirk faded slightly, though he masked it with a shrug. Hey, I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking. Keanu didn't respond immediately, letting Ryan's words hang in the air. The tension between them was palpable now, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. Keanu finally turned back to the window, his silence speaking volumes, while Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier confidence visibly shaken. The mood in the cabin shifted as murmurs of discontent began to ripple among the other passengers. Sitting 2 rows ahead, Elena Rivera, a poised Latina woman in her mid-40s, had been quietly reading a novel, but Ryan's dismissive tone caught her attention. Closing her book with deliberate care, she turned slightly in her seat to address him. Everyone, you know, Elena said, her voice steady but sharp enough to carry. People like you think first class is reserved for a certain kind of person, but maybe it's time you realize that the world doesn't revolve around your idea of who belongs where. Ryan glanced at her, surprised by the interruption. He recovered quickly, his signature smirk creeping back. Oh, don't misunderstand me, he said with exaggerated politeness. It's not my fault if some people don't know their place. Elena's eyes narrowed and her voice grew firmer. And who exactly decides their place? You? She gestured toward the economy section where the black family was now quietly seated, seemingly unaware of the brewing confrontation. Do you think their joy and laughter are any less valid than yours just because they're sitting a few rows back? Ryan chuckled, though it sounded strained. It's not about joy, it's about standards. Some of us have worked hard to be here. This isn't just some free-for-all. You mean some of us worked harder than others? Elena shot back, her tone edged with sarcasm. Or is it that you think people like them, or like me for that matter, don't deserve to sit where you do? Because that's what it sounds like. Ryan's smirk faltered, and for a moment he looked caught off guard. Then he crossed his arms and leaned back in his seat. Look, I'm just saying what a lot of people are probably thinking. I'm not the bad guy for pointing it out. Elena shook her head, her expression a mixture of disappointment and frustration. No, you're just the guy who thinks it's his job to decide who fits in and who doesn't. That's worse. By now, the tension was palpable. Several passengers had paused their conversations and were openly watching the exchange. Some nodded in agreement with Elena, others exchanged glances of unease. Keanu, who had been observing quietly, finally spoke. His voice was calm, but there was a weight to his words that immediately drew attention. Strength isn't about where you sit, he said, his tone steady and composed. It's about how you treat others. Ryan turned toward Keanu, his irritation barely concealed. That's a nice sentiment, he replied with a forced laugh, but the real world doesn't work that way. Keanu met his gaze, unflinching. The real world is made by the way we choose to act in it, and every choice we make says more about us than where we're sitting. For a moment, Ryan said nothing, the smugness draining from his expression. He shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable as the cabin grew quieter. Keanu leaned back, signaling that he had said all he needed to, while Elena gave a small nod of approval. Around them, the passengers exchanged knowing looks, the divide between arrogance and humility now starkly visible. The cabin began to settle as passengers found their rhythms, some reading, others scrolling through their phones or quietly chatting, but Ryan couldn't let go of his earlier annoyance. His eyes darted toward the black family in economy class again, where the children had started to giggle at something the father was whispering to them. Their laughter, bright and innocent, seemed to grate on him. He pressed the call button, summoning the flight attendant. When she arrived, he leaned closer, speaking in a voice just loud enough to carry. I don't want to cause trouble, but isn't it the crew's responsibility to maintain some order? That noise back there, he gestured toward the family, is disruptive. It's not exactly the atmosphere we expect up here, is it? The flight attendant hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the comment. Her professional smile faltered as she glanced back at the family. "Sir," she replied carefully, "they're not being disruptive. They're just enjoying their flight." Ryan scoffed. "That's debatable. Some of us are trying to enjoy our flight too without all the commotion." Before the flight attendant could respond, Keanu spoke up, his voice calm but firm enough to silence the murmurs around them. "Maybe showing kindness would get you further than making demands." Ryan turned toward him, his irritation bubbling over. "Kindness? That's easy for you to say. Not everyone gets it handed to them." Keanu tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "Kindness isn't handed to anyone. It's a choice." The flight attendant gave Keanu a small nod of appreciation before stepping away, sensing the tension was no longer hers to diffuse. Ryan sat back, crossing his arms with an exaggerated huff, while several nearby passengers exchanged disapproving looks in his direction. A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned to the first-class cabin, pushing a cart of refreshments. She approached Keanu's seat with a professional smile, but her tone carried a hint of warmth. "Mr. Reeves, the captain asked me to let you know your connection in Tokyo has been confirmed. He also sends his regards." The words hung in the air like a dropped pin. Several passengers immediately turned to look at Keanu, their eyes widening as recognition dawned. Quiet murmurs spread through the cabin as whispers of "Keanu Reeves" floated from seat to seat. Ryan, however, froze. His jaw tightened and his face paled slightly as he replayed their earlier interactions in his mind. The weight of his own words now felt like an anchor dragging him down. "Reeves?" he muttered, barely audible. He looked at Keanu with a mix of disbelief and embarrassment. "Wait, you're him!" Keanu turned toward Ryan with the same composed demeanor he'd maintained throughout the flight. "Is something wrong?" he asked with a faint smile, though his eyes conveyed more than politeness. Ryan opened his mouth, but no words came out. The passengers who had overheard the earlier exchanges now watched him with a mix of curiosity and judgment. The realization that he had spent the flight mocking and dismissing a global icon, a man revered for his humility and kindness, hit Ryan like a freight train. Keanu, sensing Ryan's discomfort, leaned back in his seat without another word. The cabin was silent, save for the faint hum of the engines, but the tension was palpable. Ryan fidgeted in his seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone, especially Keanu. For the first time, he appeared truly small, a man caught in the spotlight of his own hubris. Ryan fidgeted in his seat, the confident facade he had worn earlier now crumbling under the weight of his realization. He glanced at Keanu nervously, then at the passengers who had overheard their earlier exchange. Their gazes now carried a quiet judgment that he couldn't escape. Finally, he turned back to Keanu, his voice barely audible. "Rene, I didn't know you were you." Ryan stammered, his tone a mix of shame and disbelief. Keanu looked at him, his calm expression unchanged. "Does it matter who I am?" he asked softly, his words cutting through the silence in the cabin. "What matters is who you are." The weight of that statement hung heavily in the air. A few passengers exchanged knowing looks, their subtle nods signaling agreement with Keanu's sentiment. Ryan, meanwhile, shifted uncomfortably, feeling the collective judgment of the cabin bearing down on him. His earlier bravado seemed to evaporate as he tried to avoid the gazes of those around him. From her seat, Elena Rivera spoke up again, her voice steady but carrying the authority of someone who had experienced these moments too many times before. "It's not just about you," she said, looking directly at Ryan. "It's about all the people you dismiss without even knowing them. Do you think they don't notice? That we don't notice?" Her words were met with murmurs of agreement from several passengers. Nearby, a young black man, perhaps in his late 20s, adjusted his hoodie and cleared his throat. "She's right," he said, his voice firm but tinged with emotion. "People look at me all the time and assume I'm up to no good just because of how I dress. I've been stopped at airports, malls, even in my own neighborhood." Elena nodded in solidarity. "And don't even get me started on how many times I've been randomly selected for extra screening at security. It's like they see my last name on my ID and suddenly I'm a suspect." More murmurs rippled through the cabin as passengers began to share their own experiences. A woman across the aisle recounted how her mother, an immigrant, had been treated poorly on a flight for not speaking fluent English. Another man chimed in about his brother being passed over for a promotion because of his accent. Ryan's gaze darted between the passengers, his discomfort growing as their stories painted a broader picture of the biases he had embodied so casually. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the scope of his behavior, not just how it reflected on him, but how it perpetuated a cycle of exclusion and judgment. Keanu remained silent, letting the voices around him take center stage. His expression carried no trace of superiority or judgment, only quiet understanding. The collective sharing of these experiences turned the cabin into something more than a space for travel. It became a space for reflection, one that Ryan couldn't escape. The walls of his privilege had begun to crack, leaving him face to face with the uncomfortable truths he had tried to ignore. Ryan sat rigidly in his seat, his discomfort growing with every passing moment. The stories shared by the other passengers had created an atmosphere he couldn't bear. It wasn't just the judgmental stares that unnerved him, it was the truth behind their words. He felt trapped, the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. Finally, unable to contain himself, he lashed out, his voice sharper and louder than he intended. "You don't understand what it takes to succeed," he exclaimed, his frustration spilling over. "People like me worked for this. We earned it. It's not about kindness or simplicity. It's about effort, about making it to the top." Several passengers turned to look at him, their expressions a mix of disapproval and surprise. Elena shook her head slightly, and the young black man folded his arms, his eyes narrowing. Keanu, however, remained calm. He turned toward Ryan, his demeanor unshaken by the outburst. "Hard work is important," he said quietly, his voice steady but firm. "But it means nothing if it comes at the expense of others' dignity." Ryan blinked, stunned by the simplicity of Keanu's response. "What does that even mean?" he demanded, his tone defensive. "You're sitting here preaching about dignity, but what do you know about working hard to get where you are?" Keanu paused, as if carefully considering his words. Then he leaned forward slightly, his gaze level with Ryan's. "I know what it's like to struggle," he said, his tone carrying a quiet strength. "I've been through loss, pain, and challenges that money or success couldn't fix. But none of that ever gave me the right to treat someone else as less than me. Success isn't about what you have, it's about who you are." The cabin grew silent. Ryan's mouth opened as if to retort, but no words came out. The tension in the air was palpable, as if everyone was waiting to see how he would respond. Instead, Ryan sank back into his seat, his face flushed with embarrassment. His earlier bravado now seemed hollow, his words falling flat against the quiet truth of Keanu's statement. Around them, the passengers exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from approval to quiet reflection. For the first time, Ryan seemed to realize that his view of the world, and his place in it, wasn't as secure as he had always believed. Keanu leaned back in his seat for a moment, letting the tension dissipate slightly before speaking. When he finally began, his voice was calm but carried the kind of weight that commanded attention. "You know," Keanu started, looking around the cabin as he spoke, "the world doesn't need more division. It doesn't need more people trying to prove that they're better than others because of where they sit, how they dress, or what they've achieved. What it needs is understanding." His words hung in the air, drawing the attention of passengers who had been listening quietly. Even Ryan, who had spent most of the flight trying to dominate the space, sat still, his gaze fixed on Keanu. "Status doesn't make us better," Keanu continued. "Compassion does. How we treat people, especially those who can't give us anything in return, that's what defines us. Not the clothes we wear, the seats we sit in, or the titles we carry." The cabin was completely silent now, the hum of the engines the only background sound. Keanu's voice softened, but his words carried even more power. "Every time we judge someone for who they are, what they look like, or where they come from, we create more barriers. And those barriers keep us from seeing what really matters: connection, empathy, and shared humanity." Several passengers nodded subtly, their faces reflective. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but for once he didn't try to interject. Keanu looked directly at Ryan, though his tone remained kind. "We all worked to get where we are. But if you can only feel proud of yourself by tearing someone else down, then what's the point of your success? Because that kind of success, it's hollow. It doesn't last. Ryan's face flushed, his earlier arrogance completely deflated. He looked down at his hands, fidgeting nervously. Around them, other passengers exchanged glances, their expressions softening as they absorbed Keanu's words. Keanu leaned back, signaling he was finished. The silence that followed wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was reflective. It was the kind of silence that came when people were genuinely moved, reevaluating their own behaviors and beliefs. In the economy cabin, the black family who had been the target of Ryan's earlier comments were now quietly seated, their children flipping through coloring books. The littlest girl, no older than 6, tugged on her mother's sleeve and pointed toward Keanu. "Mommy," she said in a hushed voice, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "That man is really kind." Her mother looked down at her daughter, smiling warmly before glancing toward Keanu with a nod of quiet appreciation. The little girl's words, though simple, seemed to resonate more deeply than any speech. It was a reminder that children see kindness without bias, recognizing its value in ways that adults often forget. The moment created a ripple through the cabin, softening the mood further. Passengers who had been distant before now shared knowing smiles or exchanged small gestures of kindness. A shared recognition of the power of compassion as seen through the innocent eyes of a child. Ryan, for his part, remained silent, though his face betrayed the weight of everything he'd witnessed. For the first time, it seemed like he was truly reflecting, not just on his actions, but on the kind of person he wanted to be. As the plane began its descent, the captain's announcement stirred the cabin. Passengers adjusted their seats and fastened their seatbelts, preparing for landing. The atmosphere, however, remained charged with the impact of the exchanges during the flight. Ryan sat quietly, staring out the window, his earlier bravado now replaced with visible introspection. He hadn't spoken since Keanu's monologue and the innocent words of the little girl. Finally, he turned toward Keanu, his voice low and hesitant. "I've been blind to what really matters," he admitted, his words heavy with regret. "I'm sorry for how I acted, for the things I said. I thought I knew so much, but I see now that I don't." Ko looked at Ryan, his expression kind but measured. "Acknowledging it is a start," he said, his tone steady but firm. "But it's not about words, it's about actions. What you do next, that's what will matter." Ryan nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. "I don't want to be the person I've been. I want to change." Keanu offered a small, reassuring smile. "Then start by choosing differently, every day. It's not easy, but it's worth it." Ryan nodded again, his gaze dropping to his hands. For the first time during the flight, he seemed truly vulnerable, as if the weight of his realization was both humbling and freeing. As the plane touched down, something remarkable began to unfold in the cabin. The earlier tension had given way to a sense of quiet camaraderie. A man seated near the black family stood up and offered one of the children a drink he had saved from the in-flight service. The father smiled appreciatively, nodding his thanks. Nearby, a woman across the aisle reached out to Elena Rivera, helping her retrieve her carry-on bag from the overhead compartment. "That was brave of you," she said softly, referring to Elena's earlier stand against Ryan. Elena smiled warmly. "It's easier when you're not alone," she replied. Even Ryan, feeling the shift in the air, hesitated before turning to the young black man in the hoodie. "I'm sorry for the way I acted earlier," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. The young man studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Just make sure it's not just words," he replied. Passengers exchanged small smiles and nods as they filed out of the cabin, the tension replaced by a newfound sense of unity. The ripple effect of compassion had begun, sparked by the courage of a few and the humility of one man learning to change. Keanu lingered at the door, thanking the crew and flashing his trademark kind smile to those. As he walked through the terminal, the lessons from the flight seemed to linger, leaving everyone with something to reflect on long after they left the plane. The terminal was bustling as passengers exited the plane and dispersed into the crowd, each heading toward their next destination. Keanu Reeves walked calmly through the concourse, his demeanor unchanged from when he first boarded the flight. His simplicity and humility stood out even more now that the whispers of recognition had spread. Several fans approached him cautiously, unsure if he would welcome the interruption. Keanu greeted each person with the same calm warmth he had shown throughout the flight. He posed for photos, signed autographs, and exchanged brief, genuine conversations. A young woman nervously asked for a picture, and Keanu smiled, bending slightly to accommodate the frame. "Of course," he said simply, as though there was nowhere else he'd rather be at that moment. Nearby, a man in his 40s approached, hesitantly with his teenage son holding out a notebook for an autograph. "I'm sorry to bother you," the man began, his voice tinged with nervousness. "My son's a huge fan." "It's no bother at all," Keanu replied, his tone reassuring. He crouched slightly to meet the boy at eye level, handing the signed notebook back with a genuine smile. "Take care, all right?" Behind a row of seats, Ryan stood watching, keeping his distance. His earlier arrogance had faded completely, replaced by a quiet introspection. He observed the way Keanu treated every person who approached him, with patience, respect, and kindness. There was no trace of the fame or ego Ryan had assumed would define a man of Keanu's stature. Instead, he saw someone who treated strangers with dignity, regardless of who they were. Ryan's mind replayed the events of the flight, his earlier words echoing back at him like unwelcome ghosts. "Some people don't know their place. First class isn't for simplicity." Each phrase now felt heavy with regret, a stark reminder of how blind he had been to what truly mattered. Keanu finished speaking with a fan and turned to continue walking. For a brief moment, his eyes met Ryan's across the terminal. Keanu gave a slight nod, acknowledging, not judging. Ryan nodded back, feeling both seen and challenged. It wasn't an invitation to speak, but a subtle reminder. The choice to change was his to make. As Keanu disappeared into the crowd, Ryan remained standing there, deep in thought. He wasn't the same man who had boarded the plane hours earlier. The flight and the quiet strength of the man he had dismissed so easily had forced him to confront himself in a way he never had before. The lesson was clear. True greatness isn't about status or wealth. It's about humility, compassion, and the way we treat those around us. As the story comes to a close, it's impossible not to reflect on the powerful themes that unfolded during that flight. The events we witnessed weren't just about a disagreement or an awkward interaction. They were about the values that define us as people and the choices we make every day in how we treat others. Respect and humility are timeless values. They don't fade with changing trends, nor do they depend on wealth, fame, or status. These values are the foundation of genuine human connection, something Keanu Reeves exemplified with every word and action. He didn't need to assert his importance or retaliate against Ryan's provocations. Instead, his calm demeanor and thoughtful responses served as a quiet yet profound reminder that strength isn't about power. It's about grace under pressure. True success isn't measured by how much you accumulate or the social spaces you occupy. It's measured by how you make others feel, by the kindness and understanding you bring to the world. Keanu's success wasn't just in his career, but in the way he carried himself, treating strangers with the same dignity and respect he would offer a close friend. He reminded everyone on that flight, and us as well, that real greatness is rooted in compassion, not superiority. The contrast between Keanu and Ryan couldn't have been more striking. Ryan's need to assert dominance and judge others was born from insecurity, a hollow attempt to validate himself by belittling those around him. But as the flight went on, Ryan began to see the emptiness in his approach. Keanu's quiet strength challenged him to look inward, to question whether his success meant anything if it came at the expense of others. The ripple effect of Keanu's words and actions extended far beyond Ryan. The passengers in that first-class cabin left the plane with a new perspective, their hearts a little softer and their minds more open. Elena's bravery in confronting prejudice, the young black man's courage in sharing his story, and the little girl's innocent acknowledgement of kindness all came together to create a moment of collective growth. It was a reminder that change doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small moments of empathy, one person at a time. But the question remains, what would the world look like if we judged less and listened more? How much suffering could we avoid if we paused before making assumptions? How many lives could we touch if we chose understanding over criticism? These are the questions we should carry with us, not just as passengers on a plane, but as travelers through life. Every day we have a choice. We can cling to the walls of judgment and superiority that divide us, or we can break them down with acts of kindness and respect. The smallest gestures, a smile, a helping hand, or a moment of patience, can create ripples that reach further than we ever imagined. Keanu didn't need to deliver a grand speech or demand attention. He simply lived his values, and in doing so he inspired others to reconsider their own. So as we step back into our daily lives, let's take a piece of this story with us. Let's remember that success isn't about proving we're better than others. It's about lifting others up. Let's remind ourselves that humility isn't weakness. It's the quiet strength that builds bridges where others see walls. And let's strive to create a world where kindness is the rule, not the exception. What kind of person will you choose to be? What kind of world will you help create? The answers lie in the choices you make every day. Respect and humility never go out of style, and the impact of a kind heart lasts far longer than any fleeting accomplishment. Let this story be a call to action, a reminder that the change we want to see in the world begins with us. The story we've just experienced reminds us of a simple but profound truth. The way we treat others defines who we are. Our actions, more than our words or accomplishments, are the truest reflection of our character. Whether we choose kindness or cruelty, empathy or judgment, those choices echo far beyond the moment and into the lives of others. Keanu Reeves didn't need to assert his importance or lecture others to make his point. He didn't meet arrogance with arrogance or judgment with condemnation. Instead, he chose to embody respect and humility. He stood as a quiet example of the change we all wish to see in the world, a person who treats everyone with dignity, regardless of their background, status, or appearance. On that flight, his calm demeanor not only dismantled Ryan's arrogance but also sparked a ripple effect among the passengers. Each act of kindness, from Elena's courage to speak up to the passengers helping each other at the flight's end, showed how compassion can transform an atmosphere of division into one of unity. It's proof that when one person stands for what's right, it inspires others to do the same. But the lesson doesn't stop at the cabin door. This story holds up a mirror to all of us, asking, how do we respond to others, especially those who are different from us? Do we approach them with judgment or with curiosity and understanding? It's an invitation to pause and examine our own biases, to challenge the instincts that push us to divide rather than connect. The world doesn't need more people fighting to prove they're better than someone else. It doesn't need more divisions based on appearance, status, or perceived worth. What it desperately needs is more understanding, more people willing to listen instead of judge, more hearts open to kindness rather than closed by fear or insecurity. Ryan's transformation was a small step, but it was significant. His apology was a first acknowledgement of his flaws and the harm they caused. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't enough on its own, but it was a beginning, and beginnings matter. They're the moments when we decide to do better, to be better. For Ryan, and for all of us, the challenge is not in the apology, but in the commitment to change. This isn't just a story about Keanu Reeves, or Ryan, or any one person. It's about all of us. Every day we have countless opportunities to decide how we'll treat those around us. Will we choose kindness? Will we let go of judgment? Will we challenge the systems of thought and behavior that perpetuate division and exclusion? These aren't just rhetorical questions. They're the decisions that shape the world we live in. The truth is, the change we want to see in the world doesn't come from grand speeches or sweeping gestures. It comes from the small, consistent choices we make every day. It's in the way we speak to a stranger, the patience we show in difficult moments, the empathy we extend to someone who may not look or think like us. These choices define us, and collectively, they define our communities and societies. As we walk away from this story, let's carry its lessons with us. Let's remember that respect and kindness never go out of style. They're not weaknesses, they're strengths. They're the forces that build bridges, heal wounds, and create connections where there were once divides. So the next time you find yourself in a moment of judgment or conflict, ask yourself, what kind of person do I want to be? What kind of impact do I want to leave? The answers to those questions aren't always easy, but they're always worth pursuing. Be the change you want to see in the world, because respect and kindness never go out of style. In the end, it's not what we achieve that defines us, but how we lift others along the way. Let that be the legacy we strive for, one act of compassion at a time.